in next 15 minutes or so, I will be covering what are the issues of foreigners being transplanted in India. These are the three types of donor as per the Transplant Act. Near relation, which include grandparents, parents, siblings, spouse, children and grandchildren. Other than near relation, which is a broad group which include distant relative, swab transplant and the so-called unrelated, and third group is the disease donor transplant. This slide will be important once we come to the subsequent slide. The point where I want to highlight is that in donors other than near relation, the certifying the relationship by the test is little difficult, and this is a major source or major types of donor in foreigner recipient. When the act was made in 1994, in relation to foreigners transplantation, there were only two major things were mentioned. Number one, that the embassy officer of that country of origin of the recipient needs to certify some document and the relationship. And number two was that every foreigner getting a transplant in India has to be cleared from the authorization committee, and only then the transplant can be done. But it was not new. From 1995 to 2014, in 20 years period, 2,616 foreigners transplant were done, out of which kidney were approximately 1,400. And rest of the approximately 45% were the liver transplant in the foreigner recipient. In spite of these last 20 years from 1994 to 2015, when the rules were amended in 2014, very few changes were done and very few information was added, because different embassies were giving different certification format. If form number 21 was created so that there is a uniformity in the way different embassies are giving certification. And the second point was that those countries who do not have embassy in India, the government of that country needs to give certification of the documents and the relationship of the recipient and the donor. And it was also amended in this 2014 rules that if the donor is Indian for a foreigner recipient, then it should be very strictly done only if the donor is the near relation of the foreign recipient rather than otherwise. Now, this is the data which I have taken from Noto. In year 2023, the total number of a foreigner transplant out of 1842, the data available as per the country of origin of the recipient was 1,445, because approximately 400 patient data was not available with the Noto from the source of the origin of the country of the recipient. You just remember this number of 1842 into 2023. Once we went to next year, 2024, this number decreased from 1800 to 1711, and we very well know that in the middle of the last year, when the issue of the foreigner transplant from one of the country in the neighbor was raised in Jaipur, Delhi, and some other cities, the number of the transplant drastically decreased. As you see the countries from where major recipient come to India, this is the list of the countries in which at least more than 20 recipients were there, and you can see the Uzbekistan is the country from where the largest recipient has been transplanted in India, and then the next followed by Bangladesh, Iraq, and other countries. So these are the major countries from where the recipient come to India to get the organ transplant done. This is another information which states are majority doing the organ transplant for the foreigners. This is in 2024, out of 1700 approximately transplant done, the NCR region dominates in doing the foreigner transplant. Approximately 80% transplant of foreigner recipient are being done in NCR. And it is approximately 1477, followed by West Bengal, Telangana, Rajasthan, Maharashtra, Gujarat and Karnataka. The information which Noto gets from different states in relation to the origin of the country for the recipient is not complete. So this doesn't mean that only these states are actually doing transplant. There are other states are also doing transplant but not giving information to the Noto. As well as these states and NCR, even these are also not giving complete information to the Noto. Now, if you see the process or the component of renal transplant for any patient, patient is maintained on maintenance hemodialysis for a reasonable time period. Counseling of donor, recipient and the family is done in relation to transplant. Then the final workup of the renal transplant fitness is done. And then there is a perioperative period, immediate post-transplant period and a long-term follow-up. Just doing a transplant is actually not the mandate. Our mandate is that once the patient gets a transplant, he should have a long-term survival to benefit himself, his family and the society as a whole. But if you see this component of the renal transplant and compare the country of origin professional role, then local country actually manage the patient during the maintenance dialysis, does the counseling for the recipient and the donor and the family. And then the early post-transplant follow-up is also done by the country of origin, as well as the long-term follow-up is also done. So what is the Indian professional actually do in relation to the foreign transplant? There is basically final transplant workup just before the transplant and the immediate perioperative period. These are the two components with which the Indian transplant team actually manages for the foreign patient. Now then, coming to the issues, legal and the regulatory issue, documentation required passport, medical visa, proof of the relationship, donor consent voluntarily and informed, embassy verification and certification. Now here I want to highlight that the embassy, actually majority of us understand that the embassy signature on the document is very casual. They actually don't go to detail to certify the relationship. They only base on the fact of the document shown by the recipient and the donor, and on basis of that, embassy certify. The reason is very obvious that Indian law does not have any, authority over the embassy of other countries because they are diplomatic immunity against Vienna Convention, and as if anything goes wrong or unusual, the embassy cannot be held responsible by the law of the land. Then the commercial organ trade concern and the authorization committee, as I told, is a mandatory before any foreigner can get a transplant. This is one of the embassy certificate signed by one of the country. You can see the casualness of embassy. There is no date mentioned, there is no place mentioned, it's just a very casual signature and certifying that the passport and visa, birth certificate, national ID, marriage certificate. And on the top right corner, it also mentioned the relationship, which is also based on the fact what the recipient and the donor is actually saying rather than going to the documents to certify the relationship. When in 1994 the original form of the relationship was made at the beginning, it was clearly mentioned, it was mentioned that the relationship has to be confirmed by the major HLA complex. But in spite of those 20 years or 25 years, in 2014 when the rules were changed, from HLA is shifted to DNA profiling, and we will come to the lacunae of DNA profiling and HLA in relation to the foreign transplant. Now this is the certificate which is format is given by the authorization committee, and the authorization committee mandate is only to prove that there is no pressure on the donor, and the donor is voluntarily given, and there is with love and affection, and there is no monetary involvement. And I am sure all of nephrologists who are involved in a transplant program can very well assess that is anybody gets to certify these three components, that the donor is not under pressure or there is no financial involvement, and donor is giving with love and affection. Now here comes the critical issues which, with personal experience and with discussion with others, this is the type of the relationship document the foreign recipient come to India with the donor. And you can see the blue one is the donor and the red square is the recipient. And you can see there is too many link in between if you try to prove the relationship by DNA profiling. Then all those members which are linked between the recipient and donor has to come physically to the country, and this form which is certified below by so-called Notary of India and other law authority is actually made in the country of origin, and you have no way to check the authenticity of such document. But most of the time, once many of us try to prove the relationship by DNA profiling, we need to have all those link members which are in between the donor and the recipient. And the recipient mostly give many excuses that these linked persons cannot come to the country. And that is why we cannot certify, even with DNA profiling, the relationship between the so-called distant relationship between the recipient and the donor. Now coming to the medical issue which I have highlighted in previous slide, that there is a limited involvement of the Indian professional team in terms of the medical management before the transplant is done. And once with some issue, recipient come to India with a 3-month medical visa, and something arises for which some time is required, the recipient and the family usually get irritated that we are on a short visit for getting the transplant, and these things are not required. We were never told such thing. There is a lack of communication with local nephrologists in the country of origin and the Indian nephrologists. So there is no communication that what the patient current condition is and what complexity may be envisaged. Some of the patient may be high risk of infection because of the tropical region. And there are follow-up challenges. Most of the time, majority of hospital after doing transplant within a few weeks or sometime within a few days after discharge want to send the patient back to their own country for various reasons. I'm not coming to the reasons. But there is a lack of, after the patient goes back to the country of origin, there is no link between the treating team in India and the patient's long-term or even a short-term follow-up also. Many a time these countries do not have monitoring facility for the immunological monitoring, and many of the drugs are also not available, and then the issue of drugs being imported from India to the country of origin becomes very difficult, and there is a non-compliance of the drug. Administrative issue we can, I will only want to bring here is the interpreter. Most of these countries, recipient language we cannot, majority of us cannot understand. And the interpreter is also brought by the recipient family. Now we are not used to talk to the patient through interpreter, because what we are asking and what interpreter is asking to the recipient or the family, and then what they answer, and then the interpreter answer to us. At least with my experience, I'm not sure, and there is no rapport developed actually unless you are talking to the recipient and the family directly rather than through interpreter. Another is the financial issue. Whatever is told to the recipient and the family, the total cost involved, and what actually comes after the transplant, there is often a disparity, and then the dispute arises. Socio-political issue is there is a fear of medical tourism overshadowing domestic patient, cases of suspected illegality in terms of what the media perceive, and if the outcome of patients is poor, then there is a diplomatic implication. Now then, coming to some of the problems which can be solved by the newer, I should say not newer but available tests. Here is the chart where the recipient and the donor is being shown, and there is a multiple link person in between. But if you see that the donor is also female and the recipient is also female, and the origin of, if you trace the pedigree, there is a single female through which out of these two females. So what can be done? We can do mitochondrial DNA, because mitochondrial DNA is a small portion of the DNA which is transmitted from female to female. So if you do mitochondrial DNA of recipient and the donor, if both are female, then by doing mitochondrial DNA, which is never destroyed and passed on to the subsequent females, at least we can trace that the both donor and the recipient originate from the same family and not totally distant. So that much component we can prove by the mitochondrial DNA if the recipient and the donor both are female and actually belong to the same family. If the recipient and the donor both are male, then what we can do? We can do YSTR, which Y chromosome short tandem repeat. And again, these Y chromosomes short tandem repeat runs from male to the male downstream. So we can again prove if recipient and the donor both are male by doing YSTR, that they belong to the same family and not totally unrelated. Now these are some of the preventive things for making foreign transplant in India relatively smooth. We can plan that we will do only near relative if the foreigner is the recipient. A basis should be accountable for affirmative approval that the donor-recipient relationship is correctly stated and that the transplant is ethically permissible as per the both countries' law, not only Indian country law, because if the patient is being operated in India, then the law applies is Indian law, not the country of origin. But in transplant case, probably both the laws should be certified that by the embassy. Then the mandatory donor relationship, although I am saying that we should plan to operate only near relative, but occasional patient who is not near relative, mitochondrial DNA and YSTR, these are the two tests where we can at least conclude that recipient and the donor are from the same family, may not be able to conclude that exact relationship. Authorization committee should be accountable. Majority of time, many of the centers are actually doing transplant by stating that once the authorization committee has approved what is the problem in doing the transplant, without realizing when the complication arises, then authorization committee certification alone doesn't matter. There should be better communication from the country of origin professionals and Indian professionals for a better and good long-term outcome of the patient. And there should be registry and tracking of the foreigner transplant by the NOTO, which is at the moment not existing. So we cannot say. And with this, I will end my presentation. Hope to answer any question.